Welcome to our study, the Buddhist Psychology of Awakening. So this is a work by Steven Goodman, which presents the Buddhist science around the mind. And we actually have a remarkable heritage in that we actually have a psychology that has been tried and tested for 2.5 millennia, where persons again and again have confirmed that, yes, what the Buddha found actually makes perfect sense. And so we actually, right from the time of the Buddha down to the present day, have this study of Abhidharma, not as a relic, not as something that we hand down and out of sort of reverence for the sort of the age-old customs of Buddhism. We then decide to study this, but rather because it works. And this rather stands apart from the traditions that most of us are familiar with, which is a science that is continually in development and very often struggling to find its own identity. And so we have in the context of Buddhism, we have a very different situation, really. We operate with an insight that really has proven itself, and also what very much is the difference really between what we call psychology in the modern sense and Buddhism is that we operate with the notion of enlightenment, that actually this condition that drives our psychological suffering is something that's workable and it can be eliminated entirely. So we don't just operate from the perspective of wanting to achieve normalcy, be a normal person. We actually operate from the perspective of getting right to the bottom of that which drives suffering universally. So what we're engaging in here has an enormously and vastly different scope from anything that we're familiar with within our ordinary everyday conversations around the mind and other people's minds and the kind of general discourse we have on the mind. It's vastly different in the Buddhist context. And this is also where the practice of Buddhism goes far beyond just some information and actually goes into an entire different domain of practice, which is what we call the path, which is about a personal transformation, where the confusion of the mind is seen as something that needs to be dealt with, worked with. It's not just that we can identify with it and we talk about it and then we kind of sit around and maybe we gain some clarity around how we possibly can be confused, and we can identify a case history and then we can sort of talk more about it. It's about an entire change of our character, our way of handling ourselves, not in the sense of subscribing to a dogma or some sort of cult belief, but actually going in depth. And that's where Steven's discussion is really excellent, because it goes right down to the jugular of really what we're doing here, in terms of we're actually going far beyond just some sort of practice of wanting to feel better. And last time we talked a little bit about the phenomenon of what we can call mindfulness, which has gained a lot of traction in a modern context. But we're more going down to really what drives suffering universally. And so that's where we need to be quite precise and work with the mind, not just in terms of attending some teachings and hearing it, and it sounds very nice, but actually something that we need to actually properly assimilate, learn. So I hope everybody who's participating in this has actually gone through the trouble of buying the book, has the book, refers to the book, and not just refers to this material on Mondays, but actually throughout the week perhaps comes back to it and tries to particularly see how this applies in terms of our lived experience. And it's this living experience and continually coming back to what we actually are experiencing that makes this a path, not just a study. So it's on the basis of that where we begin to have a perspective which constitutes what we in Buddhism call the view. And it's with the view that we then begin to practice meditation. We sometimes seem to think that meditation is just something you do, and we sometimes even have a rather funny idea that practice is about doing things. It's not. It's about working with our minds. So let's have a look at the topic at hand. Let's see here. So, yeah. So last time Steven was a little bit comparing this to the study that we have in physics, in terms of understanding the world, in terms of what composes the phenomenal world. And that within physics, of course, we have these classifications that we call the periodic table that identifies the physical world in terms of the various elements, and what are the building blocks of phenomena. So we talked about atoms, and also we looked into quarks and so forth. And Steven goes on to say, in a similar way, the Abhidharma tradition has a very subtle and precise way of presenting what makes up our entire world, both physically and non-physically, perceptually, cognitively, somatically, physiologically, and so on. The equivalent to this atom or quark in the Abhidharma world is called a dharma. The study of the Abhidharma can be understood as consisting of becoming learned about both the essential features of these dharmas and also how these dharmas work together. So that's where we got to. So why should that be of importance to us? Let me just see if I can actually do something about this. Delete highlight. Yes. Bingo. So why should that be of importance to us? It is important because just as the study of physics, the study of the Abhidharma also shows the basic factors of existence and the basic laws that regulate their coming together. This makes up the entirety of what we so casually call and imprecisely refer to as my world, my life, my emotions, my thoughts, and so on. It's not as if it is not as we would like it to be, or think it ought to be, or hope that it's someday it will be, but is precisely as it is and has always been. So this is important. First of all, let's just be clear that we're talking about science here. We're not talking about religion. We're not talking about belief. We sometimes refer to this as metaphysics in terms of, yes, it does constitute the study of what makes up our reality, the sort of the bigger physics. But unfortunately, the term metaphysics sometimes in popular conversation and also even in philosophy refers to belief systems, like we have some overall assumptions. And that is not what we're doing in Buddhism. We do not come to Buddhism with some overall belief system. We don't come to Buddhism with cultural beliefs or spiritual beliefs, but we come to Buddhism with the intention to look at empirically, if you like, observe and understand what are the factors that are real in our existence right now. And that's where we need to look at my world. And that's where it doesn't really help if we begin to think of our world in terms of what we would like it to be. This is how things ought to be. This is how we would like one day things to be. That's not really helpful in any way. We need to look exactly at what our mind is right now. And when we're looking at that, then we're looking at the good old stuff that has always been the most innate, basic material to us, really. It's really through our consciousness and our mind and these things that we refer to as our being, that all of that is experienced through then this consciousness. That is then the domain. the domain of this science. So again, don't look to the Tibetans for extraordinary technological advances. Don't look to the Tibetans for all sorts of gadgetry. Gadgetry, that's us. Gadgetry is the modern technological world, for sure. And we are humbly indebted to that. Our medicine, our technologies in so many ways are very important. They're essential to us nowadays. And so that's where we have, you could say, the expertise. But when it comes to the mind, then we need to look at something that is not just based on a rather vague understanding of what our mind could be and our emotions and so on. We need to actually really follow the systematic approach that is presented within the Buddhist teaching. And it's on the basis of that then that we can begin our journey. But before we actually have a proper insight into what this mind is made up of, what it is that our experience is made up of, then attempting meditation and attempting the path, which is of course very good, just from the point of view that we begin to be a bit sensitized to introspection and knowing what's happening in our mind rather than just constantly operating from the point of view of reacting to what comes up in our mind. Then from that point of view, meditation practice at the early stage is very helpful. But in terms of actually beginning to work constructively with the mind and work with what we call Vipassana, then it is very helpful that we have some insight into the operation of the mind. So that's where Steven then goes on to say, Abhidharma study then moves us from the imprecise language of thoughts, emotions, feelings, intuitions, and desires into the precise language of the coming together and uncoming together of dharmas. In this case then, and we looked at last time, 75 dharmas which are discussed and categorized rather like an atomic chart on basic factors of existence. As you can remember last time, I failed rather in working my Kindle, and I found out what the problem is that I've had an American account with Kindle and have bought everything through the American account. This one, however, I couldn't buy it from the American account. I had to buy it through the Australian, and hence Kindle is deeply confused. And this is why also now I'm using the what's called the cloud reader. So last time this attempt to look at the 75 dharmas failed, and I would also like to say we'll get around to it. Last time there was a reference to it. It was more like a footnote. I took it to a place where these 75 dharmas are listed, but we're not actually going to engage in the actual looking at them yet. But this we will eventually do, and that is really where we begin to have some sense of the components that make up our experience of self. Of course, within Buddhism, we famously talk about no self. And that's something that always comes up and is sort of again and again the cause of much discussion. And that's because we have a very variegated mind that has so many different aspects to it. So to talk about a singular phenomenon doesn't really work if we analyze. At the same time, and this is where our ignorance and our habitual confusion come in, we seriously do believe there is a self. And we do believe that despite us changing all the time and having nothing whatsoever to do with anything that's unitary or consistent, we nevertheless fall back on this identity of self. And that is where, when we look at the Abhidharma and we begin to map this complexity, this conditioned nature of who we are, we begin to actually challenge this idea of a unitary mind. And this is where the study of Abhidharma is very, very helpful. We begin to find out that we are in no way a one-shot deal. We're in no way just one person. We couldn't even say we're two persons or five persons, or we go beyond that. We can't actually find a self. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't have the psychological phenomena. But the more we understand the conditions of these psychological phenomena, the less they actually can impose domination over us. And that's where we begin to free ourselves from the control they exert on us. So this is a biggie, and it's very important. Now, Steven then says, the importance of precision. That's the heading. And it says, these days, of course, most people who call themselves Buddhists don't know the names of these various aspects of reality, referring to the Dharmas. And of course, we talk about the 75 Dharmas here, but in general, we also talk about 51 mental factors or mental events. So we classify them in various ways. So the way that most of us come to the teachings is that we connect with the teaching in one way or another, but the way that we would, for example, approach the study of medicine or the study of law, which is actually learn the curriculum, is strangely absent in the modern assimilation of Buddhism. So we have a problem in that sense, a sort of a bottleneck of wanting to go somewhere, but not really having the equipment. Steven continues, we might be inspired by the teachings, recite the sutras for inspiration, or even do some practices of the Vajrayana tradition. Or maybe we simply pray for blessings from the teacher, from the teachers. But if someone asks us questions about the precise meaning of the words we use to characterize our understanding and our experience, our confidence may become rather shaky. He says there are many styles for engaging the Buddha Dharma. For instance, there is the style of studying and learning, in addition to practice, how to be more precise in a spacious way with our capacity to make distinctions. His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many other great Buddhist teachers have stressed the precise, almost scientific mode of the Buddhist teachings. It does not contradict the other mode that involves faith-based practice with an open heart. In fact, many teachers have stressed the benefit of bringing both modes together. So that, in fact, if you're sitting in this class, you clearly have made a move towards studying, and it's very unlikely that you're studying exclusively without any connection to practice. And if you're here at the Monday class, you're not going to avoid practice. We do practice here together. And these two components really are essential. Otherwise, we'll be left very frustrated, actually, because the teaching, and particularly practices, and particularly Vajrayana teachings, will continually be referring to and actually assuming some degree of insight. And if we don't have that, even intellectually, then we'll just be frustrated, actually, with these references to things that we hear about, but without actually having some experience of. A bit like if we're getting increasingly hungry and people are continually speaking about recipes, or they're talking about the menu card and so on. So there's a place where we actually need to taste the product. We need to actually have experience. Steven continues, some people love the feeling of the Dharma, but don't like to study precise words used in the authoritative texts. Others love the precise words, but if they're invited to open their heart in a ritual context, they feel they're following some cult. Perhaps it is good to find the right balance. So that's where some people would like to sort of have their own version. It's like the authoritative texts almost become irritating. If you study the precise texts, then you're seen as if you're you may be seen as a scholar, because you want to know what actually the Buddha said, and you bother to look at what the Buddha taught or the masters taught. Then people will say, "Oh, you're a scholar. You're not a practitioner." And then you have those who actually just look at the words and sort of make analysis, and very often in Western academia even have the sense that as an academic we understand much more about Buddhism than those natives out there. And the last thing such people would want to do is actually either practice meditation or engage in the actual lived lineage of practice. So that's where it's as the Dalai Lama is suggesting, and Steven also is suggesting here, perhaps it's good to find the right balance. it reminded me of something that I came across some time ago, which was some words by Chögyam Trungpa. And it's something that he said to his students before he went to retreat. And he talked about, in 1977, he did a year-long retreat. But before that, he told his students he would like them to do sitting meditation. He would like them to have good livelihood, meaning he would like them to assume their role in modern society. A lot of his students came from very sort of marginal or alternative-minded quarters. By then, he had pretty much straightened most of them out, I think. but he still insisted the value of right livelihood. So practice right livelihood. And then he also talked about study. And just for present context, I'll read you just a paragraph from what he said in that advice. He says, "It is very important for you to study if you want to survive. If you don't study, you're going to perish as if you don't have any oxygen left. If you don't study, you can't teach. And if you don't teach, you will die in depression. It is very important for you to realize the importance of it. If you don't understand the Dharma because of your lack of personal interest in learning all the details and subtleties, then you're committing yourself into a meditative nut house. You can sit a lot, but so what? If you don't study, you don't have compassion, you don't have sympathy to others in the world. You become so mean, just sitting by yourself and practicing, that there's no outlet, no way to do anything at all." So there. Not having any handle and not having any language on the Dharma means we're basically excluding ourselves from conversation. There's not really any interaction with the world around us. When we say teach, where I would think that what we could talk about here is not sitting up and pontificating on the topics of Dharma, but rather just being able to actually share insights with others. Otherwise, we're just sitting and regurgitating what everybody else believes, and we're not making any difference to anybody. Our Dharma practice doesn't affect anybody. And that's where we just end up being rather isolated. And then we can do a lot of meditation, but then again, there's not really any interaction with the world. And that's where we could talk about there not really any oxygen. We're not really interacting. So that's where there's no outlet. And that's where our practice just becomes something very compartmentalized, just something we do for ourselves. And that's where it's very helpful if we have language, and then we also have a way of engaging. It doesn't mean we have to sit down and be argumentative necessarily, but it means that we actually could engage when we can see the destructive patterns that are so persistent in so many of the belief systems that are rampant around, that are sort of current around us, and the ways that we verbalize and construct our reality. So that's where this is not about us becoming scholars, but it's about us actually caring about the world and actually engaging with the world. And that's where there's a dimension of compassion that really translates into us beginning to develop a language. And that's where this practice of Abhidharma or higher Dharma becomes very valuable. Let's see if there's some questions here. So, yes, in Buddhism we don't have any self. Then we possibly could refer to ourselves. Somebody's suggesting we could call our movement here a multiple personality order. There you go. Even then, we actually go beyond even multiple into so multiple that we can't even identify any order possibly. Anyway, multiple personality order. And then someone comments here, "He's so brilliant. I'm glad I finally bought the book." This is so nice. I can't help but be, I think a lot of us are rather touched by Steven's, well, he was a very, very nice chap. Steven Goodman was a very, very nice chap. I actually have a very funny picture of myself and him. I might actually show it to you one day. It's rather outrageous, but I'll maybe bring it up. Yes. But Steven was a delightful person. I'm so glad actually that there's really recognition of his work and that we are honoring him here. So, okay. So the Treasury of Higher Dharma. The first turning of the wheel of the Dharma consisted of the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the teaching on proper conduct, and the teaching of the four mindfulnesses as found in the Pali Satipatthana Sutta and the Sanskrit Sutra on Establishing Mindfulness, Smriti Pashtana Sutra. Smriti Pashtana Sutra. Smriti is a Sanskrit word for mindfulness. For example, the practice that we do here, we do what is called Buddha Anusmriti, is recollecting the Buddha. Yeah. So smriti, the Sanskrit word for mindfulness, on the basis of that first turning, those who came after the Buddha made commentaries. It is in this context that the great scholar Vasubandhu, the half-brother of Asanga and one of the great jewels of India, wrote a magnificent work called the Treasury of Dharma, or the Abhidharma Kosha. So again, better get used to some of these names. We have what we call the two supreme ones and the 6 ornaments. And so the 2 supreme ones were Nagarjuna and Asanga, and then we have the 6 ornaments, one of which then is Vasubandhu. And it's then Vasubandhu who wrote this Abhidharma Kosha. As mentioned before, Vasubandhu himself merely summarized all the various streams of Abhidharma teaching that existed at the time that he lived, in the 4th to 5th century of the Common Era, in the area of Gandhara, present-day Kashmir. Tradition recounts that Vasubandhu gathered all the different views extant at the time, and on the basis of those views, he would lecture all day. After his lecture, he would go home and summarize that lecture by composing one karika, a 4-line summary verse. We have these lines of text in Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, French, and English. On the basis of those summary verses, he then compiled them into almost 500 such verses, called the verses that contain the treasury of the Abhidharma, Abhidharma Kosha Karikas. So the karika are these 4 lines. Gandhara actually also includes the area around the capital of Pakistan. So if you travel between Lahore, but particularly from Rawalpindi and Islamabad up towards Peshawar and the Afghan border, you're traveling through an area that is very famous for, and also Swat Valley, for its Gandhara culture. So that, and of course also Kashmir, that whole region was very rich in terms of Buddhist culture. And to this day, if you travel to Islamabad, then it's only about a couple of hours drive from there. You can reach this amazing place called Taxila, where you had one of the first Buddhist universities. And to this day, and there are still ruins there of stupas and temples and monasteries and so on. And they're wonderfully interesting to visit because, unlike the holy places in India, nobody goes to these places in Pakistan. They don't really have a role in the Islamic culture. So you can go to these very serene, beautiful, quiet places, not so far from Islamabad, if you're passing by. Okay. So verses and commentary. After Vasubandhu wrote these verses, he then wrote a commentary, Bhashya, on them. The verses and commentary together are called the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Kosha means treasury, and treasure means something of great value. Remember that these verses, together with their extensive commentary composed by Vasubandhu, is considered an encyclopedic treasure of information on how to make manifest the direct perceptions of reality. It contains an account of all the possible interactions between the basic factors of existence, the Dharma. So, for example, the Tibetan for Abhidharma is actually Ngomba, which just means manifest. So the whole point really with the Abhidharma Kosha is for us to begin to see clearly, to gain knowledge of reality. Basically what we mean with science, knowledge. So that's where, thanks to this, we can begin to get some appreciation for and see reality clearer. Stephen writes, according to one tradition, one would memorize the verses, the karikas. When I first heard verses, I thought it's poetry, but actually they are very terse and condensed verses with almost no grammar, and you can barely make sense of it. I actually remember Eric Schmidt, he refers to it as telegram language. You know, when you write, you know, arriving 2 p.m., be there, forget this, remember that, stop, see you tomorrow, stop. You know, that kind of almost absence of grammar is very much what you have in some of these karikas. Very, very short. And Tibetans themselves continued that tradition. So in the living traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, monastics memorize these verses as a mnemonic device. They aren't meant to make sense of the verses by themselves. They are very terse, and you do need a shastra. But then again, once you do memorize, then you could possibly make sense of them. But it's true, they are very terse, and in and of themselves, without a commentary, very difficult to access the meaning. In his commentary, Vasubandhu explains what each particular dharma or factor of reality means. Then he tells us that some thinkers in the tradition have different views on the meanings of some key points. Often Vasubandhu cites the names of the people who posed certain questions or objections. And then we have Vasubandhu's response to the effect of, so you say, but in truth, this is based on the following error of your thinking. He does not he does this not to shame the person asking the question, but rather to sharpen the sword of their capacity to note distinctions relevant to the wide variety of specific points. And here there's actually something that's rather important in terms of study and also understanding the tradition of Buddhism and the science of it, which is that the point of study is to understand reality, and sometimes then you could say some of the science is flawed. That's like in the science that we might have. And then if somebody comes along and, you know, proves, you know, let's say we had the sort of the, what was it again, the view that the Earth is the center of the universe, and that was valid until you then had the likes of Galileo and Copernicus and so forth that actually showed, no, the Earth is not the center of the universe. It works the other way around. They did this on the basis of not, you know, it wasn't on the base, it wasn't at gunpoint. They actually substantiated this with findings, empirical verification, etc. And the same really applies to logic. It's similar if you're doing equations and you find out there's a mistake in the equation. When you show let's say there's somebody who does math and somebody can show that there's a mistake in the equation, they can't get upset. They should rather say, oh, thank you, you've actually pointed out the flaw in my method. And so there you have to, the person whose flaw in method has been exposed shouldn't take it personally, but rather there's something being enhanced. And likewise also in the old India, when in terms of the systems that you had, in terms of logic and so forth, if there was a logic that was flawed, then it was a question of acknowledging that yes, this actually doesn't work. So we have that in science in general, we have that in logic, in mathematics, and so on, and it also applies in this area here. In fact, in the old India, if somebody was shown to be their view was flawed, and somebody else showed that their view was flawed and showed them they could say the flawless logic, then naturally the other one would have to concede and say, yes, you're right. And so you often had also students would then actually begin to follow another teacher. That was quite common, you know. If there was a debate and someone was exposed to have a weak logic and so on, well, then the students would follow this new teacher. And this is not really this is interesting, but it's because you're not changing your teacher or following another teacher on the basis of you don't like the person or whatever. It's simply just that you could say, they're more onto it, they're sharper, they're clearer, and so forth. So that's where this culture of discussion is so valuable. What we have nowadays is, in the name of you could say freedom of religion, you can just believe anything. And you can sit with your own flawed logic and nobody's going to challenge you. And that's where you're welcome to believe all sorts of things that, you know, you could be a terrible waste of time. And that's where it's not about really being right or wrong, but just really identifying what works and what's valid. So that's why when you see the practice of debate as you have it in Buddhist contexts, it's really to sharpen, just like you have debating societies in high schools, it's really just to sharpen your ability to cut through what's flawed and be able to identify and be more discerning in terms of seeing what's valid. Okay. Wow, big one here. Some of you are very fast typers. Okay, someone says, please do show us the picture. You've triggered our intrigue now. Okay, I'll bring it along next time. Okay. I must agree with Trungpa Rinpoche's advice. It happened to me just recently to have friends over and asking me about my practice, and seeing that there was some interest in the topic, I tried to, in a nutshell, describe what we do on the path. And I must say, I felt quite disappointed with myself for having not found the right words and approach to get them more interested. I wouldn't say I turned them off, however. This makes me feel like I must continue to study and cultivate more skills on how to communicate skillfully what we do on the path, even though it's very dear to me, even though it is very clear to me. And that's true. That's very much, you could say, natural, because, you know, again, coming across something where you can see there's some flawed assumptions that are so rampant in many of the assumptions people around us operate from, then it would only be fair enough to say, well, you know, maybe we could see things in a different way. So sooner or later, you're going to have to spill the beans that you're not quite believing in the things you used to believe in. And so there is a compassionate element that lies in this speaking about it. So I'm glad your friends have not, you know, sometimes in the Byron Shire, everybody, and also in California and other places, people might believe things that are so crazy that their friends, just when they come and visit, they just don't talk about it, because, you know, this person believes in, you know, God knows what. So that's where it just becomes sort of like something we don't talk about. But if there really is an intelligent interaction with the friends and an openness and so forth, and then of course this is the most natural thing, and it also really is an expression of compassion. And that's where it's valid to actually then actually go in and see, what does the Buddha say? Because the thing is, we could start weaving our own version of the Dharma, and that's why it's important. There's such a shortcut if we actually look at what the Buddha said, because the Buddha actually has some, if we really begin to understand what the Buddha and the commentators and the masters say, they're not talking a language that is situated within a distant past, but they're very precisely operating with concepts and ideas that are completely relevant for our immediate situation. So, discernment. In fact, what is being exercised and what is working here is one out of 75 factors or dharmas, the one we call discernment, prajna. So when we're talking about the Buddhist path, we very often talk about we're developing something called wisdom, which is what enables us to not be deceived. And this is what the beauty actually of the path is, that we're really just, the liberation will not lie in doing something supernatural, but really just in seeing clearly. And that's predominantly really what prajna is about. It's that ability to cut through, discernment. So that's one of the 75 factors. Stephen continues, this discussion of prajna that comes from the Abhidharma Kosha states that it is itself a dharma, a factor of reality, which is present as the capacity to make fine, precise distinctions with respect to the nature and functions of all factors. It is that special dharma that makes it possible to have knowledge of all the other dharmas, to have precise knowledge of the other dharmas. The Sanskrit phrase that defines this discernment is dharmanam pravichaya. In this book, following along with Vasubandhu, we will be exploring our own capacity for discernment in order to clarify the meanings of the variety of distinctions that account for the multiplicity of our experiences. We could also very briefly say that prajna is also what sees dependent arising. And when we are studying Abhidharma, we're going to be studying a number of different factors, but the bottom line is that we're beginning to see that phenomena exist in dependency, and as such, they don't have autonomy. They don't exist solidly the way that we in our ignorance label them. And that in itself, just seeing that, really is the scope of prajna. And that's where prajna enables us to extract ourselves from this deception where we solidify phenomena in terms of being solid, in terms of having, you could say, some unitary or essential monolithic identity, good, bad, etc. And that's where prajna is what cuts through that. So right from the start, we should appreciate prajna, that which sees then the lack of solidity in things. And the overall then value of this lies in seeing the dependent arising. But we're going to be being quite specific then in going in understanding this multiplicity or this complexity of dependently arisen phenomena. Now, other traditions of Abhidharma, no conflict. So that's the next heading. Stephen says the basis for our discussions of higher Dharma are teachings based on what in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions are classified within the so-called first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. It is the so-called way of the listeners, Shravakayana, and sometimes classified as the Hinayana, the lesser way, which does not delve into the greater way, Mahayana formulations of similar topics. So, of course, this is a particular Mahayana way of seeing it, and this is a particular way that probably, if you were to promote the idea of Hinayana in outside Mahayana circles or Tibetan Buddhist circles, they might not appreciate they might not appreciate the term lesser way. And it's also very important that practitioners of Mahayana don't identify Hinayana with particular living traditions. So I don't know what you might have heard, but please don't start referring to the Hinayana teachings as some living tradition out there. That will be very insulting. But at the same time, in the Mahayana journey and in the journey of the path, it's important that we identify the gradual path and the value of these foundational perspectives. So while they don't have the complete vision that we then develop along the path, and that's particular to the Mahayana, then nevertheless they have a very real role. And this is where people like Chogyam Trungpa are very, very skillful in terms of presenting the gradual path and presenting how the foundational vehicle really applies in terms of our practice. Very often, if you just sort of land straight in Mahayana discourse, you might right away just develop some sort of rather chauvinistic attitude that there's some sort of beginner path down there that you needn't concern yourself with. Stephen continues, the main text that was studied by Tibetan Buddhists for so-called Mahayana Abhidharma is the compendium of the higher teaching Mahayana, the Mahayana Abhidharma Samuchaya, a text attributed to Vasubandhu's half-brother Asanga. The approach of Vasubandhu, which we follow here in this book, contains 75 dharmas, whereas the Mahayana approach contains 100 dharmas. There is, however, no real contradiction in approach. Although we follow the listing of 75 dharmas in this book, it is not the only way. The 19th to 20th century Tibetan master Ju Mipam Rinpoche, in his Gateway to Knowledge, discusses 10 expert knowledges mentioned in Maitreya's discriminating between the extremes and the middle, the Majjanta Vibhaga. And then, in according with this schema, he engages in a presentation of these dharmas, combining both Shravakayana and Mahayana definitions of them. The point here is that whether one studies the Abhidharma Kosha of Vasubandhu or the Abhidharma Samuchaya of Asanga, or both, there are no major contradictions. The lists are somewhat different, but the basic dynamic principles are the same. Everything is dharmas, and they can be divided into conditioned and unconditioned dharmas. Both the Shravakayana and the Mahayana Abhidharma accept that, and both the Shravakayana and the Mahayana Abhidharma agree that conditioned means arising due to causes and conditions and being subject to dissipation. Both approaches accept that reality is an unconditioned state, not subject to causes and conditions. And this again is an important point, because regardless of what system we subscribe to, we're going to be identifying that phenomena exist on the basis of conditions. And as such, like we can say here, they're subject to dissipation in the sense they're impermanent. But more than that, it also means that phenomena don't possess what we call inherent existence. Something that is conditioned doesn't exist unconditionally. And what we do as sentient beings is that we attribute solidity. We label things solidly as being one way or another. And that's where the Buddha comes in and say, it's just like in a movie, it's just like in a dream, it appears, yet it's just due to conditions that we have this perception. And that's where, again, that's prajna that sees that. And it is then freeing ourselves from these conditioning that we begin to have a broader perspective. And that's where we talk about reality as something that's unconditioned. And this is very beautiful, because that means if you emerge as someone who has studied and understood what the Buddha taught, you won't come out with a huge head and a large opinion. You'll come out clear and sane and without an opinion. You'll be free of dogma. And what unfortunately drives samsara is our habit to falling into dogma, that we want to label and diminish things into fitting into pigeonholes. So the beauty of being opened up, the beauty of this study is that it's going to open up to something that is completely free from conditioning. And that's the entire point of studying these various aspects, is that they'll enable us to see how, in fact, they're just these things that rule us are nothing but paper tigers. They just stand as a number of various causes and conditions. Just like in, what is it again? The Wizard of Oz. You know, there's some assumption that there's some great reality that controls us, but actually, if we go in and sort of lift the curtain, there's nothing but there's a little ignorant assumption there that drives the whole machinery. So that's where the approach really that we have in terms of the Abhidharma is we will be set free through seeing the truth of this constructed conditional nature. Can you clarify for me why Shravakayanas are called listeners? Well, you know, actually what Shravaka means, it comes from the Sanskrit Shruti and Waka. In Tibetan, it's Tudrak. And it's very interesting, because basic to the Mahayana teaching is that it was actually transmitted to a large extent by students who didn't necessarily practice it. And that means that they heard these teachings and they passed it on. So they were what we call Tudrak in Tibetan, or Shravakas. They had heard and they passed it on. And these then were classified as those who were not practicing the Mahayana, but that nevertheless, as students of the Buddha, they were persons who had heard and they could present the teachings. Now, what we end up referring to the Shravakayanas are then those who could not embrace the Mahayana, and that's why we talk about the Shravakas. And Shravakas, they then consists of the Shravakayana, Prachekya Buddhayana, and the Bodhisattvayana. Usually when we talk about in general the three yanas, we talk about then the Shravakas, the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. So the Shravaka is really the first level on the path. Again, we can refer to this as Hinayana in the sense that this is the foundation. And then we could say this is where we begin the journey really in terms of hearing the teaching and relating and practicing it and working with ourselves. It's once we've worked with ourselves then that this expands then into a greater perspective of compassion and working for others, and also a greater vision of reality. So somebody else asked, why are Shravaka Yanas called listeners? Yeah, because of that, because actually the Shra comes from. Why can't they embrace the Mahayana? Oh, they can. I mean, it's not them, it's us. Why can't we embrace the Mahayana? Well, we will. We will. We're all Shravakas, by the way. So there you go. We're all Shravakas. We begin as Shravakas. We're aspiring to the Mahayana. So in that sense, we sometimes refer to them as, if there's some people out there who are Shravakas, but there's also very much a sense that this is a journey that's common for everybody on the path. So, like Dingochen's Rinpoche would often say, you know, when you feed a child, the first child has to be nurtured by mother's milk, and only gradual after that you begin to give them sort of more tougher foods. Aren't both Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha Yana both Hinayana? Yes, they fall into the category of Hinayana, both of them. So the Shravakas believe that there's some substance to consciousness and some substance to the phenomenal world, and the Pratyeka Buddhas they have less fixation on, I can't remember, on either it's on the self of person or the self of phenomena. So there's less obscuration in the case of the Pratyeka Buddhas. Yeah. Okay. Do a little more. There was a question there. So the Shravakas can be said to be practicing the narrow way. Yes, yeah. And the narrow way is important because that's where there's no side tracks. The thing is, sometimes we can come into Buddhism and there's so many tracks that it's just like dizzying. And that's why it's quite important that from the start, actually, we have some guidance that give us a discipline. That's why it's quite helpful, actually. And this is where the modern situation of where anybody can go in and read a zillion books, you know, scour the internet and so forth, can be incredibly confusing. Whereas the traditional way is to just be given a few instructions and then practice meditation, experience simplicity, and begins to beginning to actually connect with Earth before we sort of get lost in all sorts of worries and speculations and so on. So that's why it's very helpful to have to begin with the Hinayana, the narrow way, literally. Okay. So I'll just read a little bit on the next one. The mind, so this heading is, the mind is sharpened by clear and distinct definitions. So in the great Indian traditions of study, one makes concrete lists and then goes very carefully by the list. This is not to say that Indians were interested in collecting lists, but it was felt as a matter of pedagogy that the mind is sharpened by having very clear and distinct definitions that precisely orient the mind and attention. So actually yesterday, in the context of finding rest in the nature of the mind, I was also talking a little bit about the value of what we call structural outlines or contextual logic, which you have when you study any work in the Tibetan or in the Indian tradition, that you actually have a clear understanding of the classifications. Where we normally, with our list of contents and headings, it's a bit more vague because it doesn't actually clearly set into context the exact outline. And that's where right from the first letter of a book in an Indian or Tibetan work, you actually have a complete contextual outline of how everything fits together. It's extraordinarily valuable, and it accommodates, again, this need for precision and really understanding what is being talked about. So Stephen then says these definitions were thought to be necessary in order to truly hit the target referred to. For example, in the words of my perfect teacher, Paltrimji speaks of 3 defects, 6 stains, and the 5 wrong ways of remembering when you study. The 5 wrong ways of remembering are remembering the words, but forgetting the meaning. Remembering the meaning, but forgetting the words. Remembering both, but with no understanding. Remembering them out of order. Remembering them incorrectly. So that's where the student would want to be able to make sure that he or she doesn't have any of these flaws. And Paltrimji, Stephen quoting then Paltrimji, then he, or rather referring to Paltrimji, he says it's not enough to come out of a teaching and says, it was such a great teaching, it was so profound, the teacher was so inspiring. But then when asked what was said, you reply, oh, it doesn't matter, it was just so inspiring. According to Paltrimji, this is a defect. Having a defect doesn't mean we're going to hell or we're going into a deep precipice and never returning. It just means it will delay us a bit on our journey to directly perceiving reality. This way of going through lists is meant to help sharpen the intellect. Okay, so 4 categories of Bhutan. Those who knew the Dharma very well thought that perhaps this word Dharma was the deepest and most important word of all. This is actually, I would like to say, I agree. This is where we're moving from the realm of mysticism, spirituality, religion, meditation into something that is quite precise. And we're really going to be, Stephen here actually, he does us a great favor in actually bothering to go through what we really mean with Dharma, because this is what you're doing here. I'm sorry, you're studying Dharma, so we need to be clear that Dharma has significance, and it's not just a vague sort of concept. I remember once I was traveling to India, and there was somebody who was very inspired about, feeling very positive about the prospects of going to India and studying there. And she was coming from Sweden. She had the loveliest accent, and she says, "Oh, I just love all these things about karma and dharma." And we and there is something very sweet about this sort of the romanticizing the idea of just, oh, Dharma. And it was this, we're talking the 1970s, right? You know, I remember Jethro Tull had a tune which was something about Dharma. I don't know, some of you might remember, and so on. So it was sort of a fashionable word, Dharma, you know. So obviously it's hence quite valuable that we actually bother to find out what we really mean with the word Dharma. Stephen goes on to say, the great Tibetan scholar, the great Tibetan Buddhist scholar Bhutan, who lived from 1290 to 1364, wrote a magnificent work called A History of Buddhism, and was instrumental in compiling the first widely available Tripitaka, the collection of the Buddha's teaching. In doing this, he closely studied the variety of available texts. In his History of Buddhism, he divides the discussion of the meaning of the key term Dharma into 4 sections. Different reference for the term Dharma, the etymology of the word Dharma, the definitions of Dharma, the variety of types of Dharma in the sense of Buddhist teachings. So we're going to look at the first one, Dharma as reference. And that's actually where we're going to look at. You very often hear this in the Tibetan traditions. They'll say, oh, Dharma is a very important word. It has 10 definitions. And that's actually comes then from Vasubandhu. So we're going to look at that next time, the 10 meanings of the word Dharma. So there you go. Bit of Abhidharma. So no questions? No questions asked? Okay. So we'll conclude. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you. So as usual, we'll have a few minutes break, and then I'll say a few things about meditation, which is then the actual purpose of what we're doing here. Everything else is just the menu card. Without actually putting our teeth into experience, then what we're studying here won't really have that much value. So we'll just have a few minutes break, and then we'll talk a little bit about meditation, and then we'll actually do it. Okay, let's go off air for a moment. So now here on the banks of this splendid lake, I think it's somewhere in Alberta, we'll have a little bit discussion on meditation. Alberta in Canada. So meditation is what takes Buddhism out of the realm of theory. So we could very well, with all the brilliant statements we have in Buddhism, we could well produce a whole army of people who had a lot to say. But actually the beauty of the Buddhist tradition is that the sages actually are remarkably quiet and non-aggressive and pleasant to be around. It's not like you're walking into a zone of thoroughly opinionated philosophers or academics that have a lot to say. There is a lot to say, but as we have in the example of the Buddha, what has been said was never spoken without being asked. And so the beautiful example of the Buddha when he was asked to teach was that he replied, "I'm not sure this will be understood, so I'll rather stay quietly here in the forest." And then at the repeated requests, then the Buddha did teach. And this really has signified how the Buddhist teaching has emerged in the world, not as something that was spread with missionary zeal, but rather something that was shared on the basis of there being a genuine interest. And so that, you could say, organic nature comes from the wisdom and the insight of the Buddha being one that is profoundly in harmony with the world and with the goodness that's innate to the external nature and also the goodness that's innate to the students. When we as students approach a Buddhist teacher, what's so wonderful about the teachers are not what they say, even though that's valuable, but also above anything, their character and the interaction with their character. And this is because the nature of the Dharma is that which goes beyond words, which is the nature of truth. And the lived truth then manifests beautifully, both in terms of how someone lives their life, but also how they interact with others. There's a sort of a dance and a harmony that takes place in the expression of truth. And so one of the most beautiful things that we could witness is really hearing a great teacher teach, not just from the logic and the rationality and the, you could say, the feasibility of the logic, but rather the way that it's transmitted. And so this comes from a deep experience, not just from having gone through a rigor, a scholarly rigor, even though, as we've seen, that also has a role. That also has a place in terms of us actually making sure that we get it right. But ultimately, you see, that's really just to inform then something much deeper, which is then connecting with reality and not being deceived and not being sidetracked, not being fooled in that process. And that's where learning the what we could call the middle way, or the Dharma of words, is really solely for the purpose of experiencing the middle way of reality. And that reality is not limited to labels and concepts and philosophies. And hence the nature of this is an engaging with reality. It's an engaging with truth beyond words. And that is what the practice of meditation facilitates. Of course, we find this in many different traditions, through prayer, through bhakti, through so many different ways that we connect with that which is greater than just ego and agendas of aggression and self-centering and so forth. The ways of connecting with the sacred nature of our reality is found in so many different ways. And certainly in the Buddhist teaching, what we do is sit, and we facilitate connecting then with reality through two foundational modalities, which we call Shamatha and Vipassana. And Shamatha is the practice of being quiet. And it's with being quiet that we then can connect with reality. And it's through connecting with reality that we begin to gain a greater perspective. Shamatha is that we begin to be able to hear, that we begin to open up and connect. And Vipassana is then that we begin to understand reality around us. And that's also where we begin to become interested in reality. We're not just caught up in our own regurgitation and reactions to reality, but we're interested in knowing a greater reality. And that's where, to some extent, the studies that we do in terms of the Abhidharma can really help us be able to understand this reality better. I don't know if the example is entirely worthwhile, but you know, we could travel, and we could, on our travels, we could meet somebody that cheats us. We could be foreigners in a country where we're very easily fooled, and to some extent, our sort of intuition could help us a lot. Our sort of humane insights and so forth, but there would also be times when we might simply not have the information that is helpful. So you might arrive in Paris and somebody might want to sell you stocks in the Eiffel Tower, or you might arrive in Athens and somebody might wants to sell you stocks in the Acropolis, etc., or in the Sydney Harbour Bridge, or what have you. So that's where you could possibly, through your intuition, sense that this is something's, you know, not quite right. But on the other hand, also, it's quite helpful to have some understanding of the legislation, an understanding of what's possible and not possible. And that is where it's quite helpful to have an understanding of the Abhidharma in terms of how our reality is screwed together, how the mechanics of our reality. But then again, ultimately, the application of this insight really has so much to do with our presence and our intelligence and ability to integrate that. And that is where we then again need to integrate that through the experience that is facilitated through the peace and the quiet of shamatha. So these two work together. Shamatha and Vipassana, they operate together. And particularly within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is not that much an emphasis on going into some deep trance. There's a very much right from the start, particularly in the traditions that practice what we call Dzogchen and Mahamudra. There's a very much emphasis on uniting the quality of sitting with the quality of non-deception or insight. And so these two really work together. Shamatha and Vipassana very much work together. So as far as the practice that we do goes, the most obvious aspect of meditation is that we sit quietly. Very often let's just say we were sitting at this lake here, right? And we could sit at this lake and really connect with this lake, but we could also immediately begin to take pictures of it. We could also immediately, we could begin to text back to our friends saying, hey, I'm having a really Zen moment by this incredibly beautiful lake here in Canada. It's just so far out. And then our friend would text back saying, wow, tell me more. Maybe write a haiku. And at this point, we could get very busy. We might think that of course this would possibly be our way of celebrating the beauty, and certainly we have within the Japanese and many other traditions the sort of the expression of appreciation by means of poetry, haikus, art, and various forms. But it's questionable: are we really connecting with the nature? Are we really connecting with the peace of this space? Are we actually really connecting? Or are we busy imposing our version on it? And that's where the practice of shamatha, as much as it might look as if we're very passive, is actually allowing for a space where we could begin to actually experience rather than just be constantly users, or you could say imposing our version of things without getting busy. So shamatha is really an incredibly profound way, and it's a method. It is something about doing something, but it's a way of doing something that connects us with reality. And so that's where the practice of shamatha is called mindfulness, in that we're fully present. That's what we mean with mindfulness. There are methods in mindfulness that enable us to not be carried away. We could think, oh, I must now get on my phone and text a haiku to my friend. And that is a thought. And if we practice shamatha, we would know this is an impulse, this is a thought. And we could say, okay, there's a thought. We needn't actually begin to get frustrated. Oh, there I go with my busy mind. We just say, okay, there's a thought, but I think I'm just going to keep sitting. And that's where what is very helpful is to have something that anchors us and actually prevents us from just tagging along with any impulse, any thought, any narrative, any sort of impulse to rumination and so forth, and actually bring us back to the present. And that is where the method of mindfulness is very precise. We come back to the breath. We might have other ways of coming back to being present, but the breath is something that enables us to connect. And what we essentially are doing is connecting to that which is beyond just this normal sort of almost imperialistic way that we roll out our version of the world upon the world itself. And so that's where we can have the breath, but we could also sometimes invoke, and what we do here is actually invoke the Buddha. And the presence of the Buddha is not going to ruin our view of reality, rather it's going to empower us to be even more open. And so in the practice of Buddha Anusmriti, as we do it here in Jamgon Mipam, which is treasure of blessing, that's where we connect with the Buddha's image, and yet it doesn't in any way block our perceptions. This is what we call the practice of visualization. But either way, the practice of not getting seduced by, carried away, and controlled by this busy mind is then the foundation of meditation. And so we call this shamatha, in that it creates a space of peace. We have the practice of sitting. So we have a physical posture. It doesn't have to be on the floor. Mainly is that we're comfortable, and that our spine is straight, that we're not slouching or leaning, that the lower part of the back is holding us. So we could sit on a chair. Chair is probably helpful for most of us who grew up in a culture where we sit on chairs. But if you can, then sit on a cushion, or if you're very yogic, then you can sit on the floor and so forth. But the point is more just to have a posture. The second point, or further aspects of this, then also include taking the shoulders a little bit back, taking the chin a little bit in, lowering the gaze, relaxing the jaw, hands on the knees or in the lap. Did I forget anything? Kind of that. That's more or less it. So that's basic to the way that we carry ourselves. And again, you can refer to a Buddha statue. And simply just sit as the Buddha says. Yes, the tongue, that's right. Yes, your tongue should touch the palate of your mouth. Yeah. So that's where you have this what we call the seven points of Vairochana. So that for the physical posture. The second aspect here is then the way that we enable to ground the mind, and in general we'd say through coming back to the breath. So we're going to be doing the Buddha Anusmriti, which is where we focus the mind on the Buddha, and particularly there we focus on the Buddha with something that takes us beyond our ordinary narratives and our ordinary constructions of self and the objects of our mind. And that is where this bhakti of thinking of the Buddha enables a wider experience, which we call blessings. It's very much premised on devotion. It's very much premised on our appreciation for the Buddha. Sometimes we can think of the Buddha, we can think of our guru, but something that to some extent stops the ordinary conceptual mind. And that's where something can come through that goes beyond the ordinary mind, which we then call blessing. So whether we focus on the Buddha or we focus on the breath, both are then what constitute the object of mindfulness. When we do the Buddha practice of Buddha Anusmriti, we actually when we come to the solution, where we consider that the Buddha blesses us with rays of light and we achieve the condition of no more learning, is really just the point where we dissolve reference points and then just settle our mind. And that is where then where it's quite helpful to just come back to the breath. This is not really about beginner or advanced, but it's about effectively achieving some degree of non-conceptuality. And so if we have the breath, it's something that's not conceptual. It's a reference point, but it's not conceptual. Whereas we could very well sit and thinking, okay, I'm just going to relax into the non-referential condition that could sometimes result in sitting and wondering what is exactly this non-referential condition, or what is wisdom, what is rikpa, etc. So that's why it can be rather a shortcut to just simply come back to the breath. The third point then has to do with the thoughts that inevitably arise. So one thing is that we can actively anchor our presence through the practice of mindfulness, coming back to the breath or coming back to the image of the Buddha or whatever. But there's also a place where thoughts that arise, they inevitably they arise, and they will arise regardless. And the third aspect is, as thoughts arise, to not be absorbed by them, to not be carried away, to not be distracted by them. And this is not so much about us doing something about them. It's about us not doing anything. It's about us not being distracted by them, seduced by them, controlled by them. So that's where whatever thoughts arise, this then provides an opportunity really to just not be. This enables us to have an opportunity to train ourselves in letting go of thoughts. So as thoughts arise, we train ourselves in letting go of them. The thoughts themselves are an expression of the mind. They're an expression of the creative quality of the mind. What we need to do is just not follow after that spark that arises with the thoughts. So simply just allow the spark to be there, but not necessarily follow after the thoughts. So the third aspect is really just as thoughts arise, to not be absorbed in them, to just label thoughts thinking. And this provides a condition of actually beginning to be present beyond just the normal absorption, the normal distracted state that perpetuates our self-centering. So this is really the key then into a greater insight or greater perspective beyond just ourselves. So despite what meditation looks like, it is actually something that opens up to a perspective far greater than just ourselves. So this is where then the shamatha becomes the foundation of vipassana. And if we then have some insights on the basis of having studied the nature of reality, we are less prone to be fooled by our projections. And on the basis of that, then also this is the place from which we practice not getting carried away and entangled in the conceptual mind. So this provides really the foundation for both what we call analytical meditation and also settling meditation. But the bottom line really is that with non-distraction, we begin to be less caught up in the ordinary ruminations and distracted conditions of the mind. So, like I said, here we'll start with the practice of the Buddha Anusmriti, the liturgy, and simply chanting that. Then we invoke really, or create an atmosphere of something sacred through invoking the presence of the Buddha. And we can also think of the Buddha as representing our teacher, representing all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the Vijayadharas, the Kinis, and all deities of the three roots, the three kayas, and what have you, all simply joined within the form of the Buddha. So in this way, the presence of enlightenment as embodied is then what we sustains our attention. And then invoking this through the very beautiful liturgy of Jamgun, then we chant the Dharani, and then we settle into meditation, and then we conclude the practice with the with making some aspirations. So that's what we do. There's a little bit of time, so if anybody has questions, take some questions. Okay, lips, mouth slightly open so we can breathe both through nostrils and the mouth. Yes, so we put the tongue on the palate and also leave the mouth slightly open. Yeah, that's right. So your nostrils might be blocked. It's helpful to keep the mouth open also. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we'll just take a 2-minute break and then we'll begin. Okay, we haven't actually started yet, but there's somebody who asked a very good question and is asking, is this shift from shamatha to vipassana a natural one? Yes, it is indeed, and it is really within this condition of not being distracted that we also not follow the thoughts that ordinarily center and perpetuates that normally center on ourselves. So we have these thoughts that normally, if you look at how we think, they're very often about how am I doing, and they're very much about how to strategize in terms of serving ourselves, and very often even our distracted thoughts, however neutral they might be, they very often are essentially the foundations of a distracted state of that is basic to the ignorance and the delusion of samsara. So whether they're obviously aggressive or they are obviously desirous or they're just completely neutral, phlegmatic if you like, they nevertheless constitute a distracted state that is basic to the foundations of our confusion. So by not being distracted by thoughts in the ordinary sense, then we actually begin to open up to a wider perspective. It's a bit like the difference between being lost in thought and then actually beginning to be present. You know, sometimes we can see people being lost in thought. They're sort of all caught up in their own thing. And then we might actually just sort of come over and say, hey, and they actually might sort of come back. Oh, yes. So yes, the shift from shamatha to vipassana is a natural one, but at the same time also they kind of worked together, because also without the foundation of non-distraction, then we don't sustain really this wider vision. So that's why we inevitably need to have both. And that's why we can see in the example of the lives of actual great practitioners, they sit a lot. And of course, it's not that they're just sitting in a shamatha sense, it's very much sitting in a vipassana sense, and particularly in the traditions of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, a lot of practice of sitting. And this sitting also then is what informs everything that is done in terms of the Vajrayana path, in terms of the 4 empowerments and so forth. It's basic to all Vajrayana practice, this unity of Shamatha and Vipassana. Okay. So I think on page 3 maybe, as far as I remember. Yeah. Sorry, one thing I still need to do. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel lion throne and lotus, sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings, encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all the virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Om 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 muni muni mahamunaya soha. From the Buddha's body, there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never again return to samsara. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms and perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging, no death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dharmadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual, and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping on to a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi, where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the three gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the three times, and the three types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in the Bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun, may the holders of the teachings live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyan Jagadukani nignada Akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyan Jagadukani nignada Tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignada. Tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignada. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. So, thank you. Just an announcement. Next Monday, like I said last time, I'm going to hijack this session here from 5 to 7 in honor of this being 29 years since Kyabje Dilgu Rinpoche passed on. We would say changed Buddha field. And just to invoke Rinpoche's presence, then we'll watch, and I'll stream this. I'll stream this to just log on to go to webinar as you normally would do, but there's a way we can then stream a video of a documentary on his life, which is called Brilliant Moon. Some of you might have seen it before, but it's liberation by seeing, and then this will be followed by a practice of a bit like this practice we just did, but very much focusing on Rinpoche. So it's called the practice of Guru Yoga, and it's a short practice called the Heart of Blessings. So, but this then invoking Rinpoche. So we'll do that, and that's the program for next Monday. So. That's it. Then there's some people who asked a question. Sorry, it's an ignorance quick question for the mantra. Why we chant Teyata first and then not? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I forget what the meaning of Teyata is. We call it a Dharani when it says the Teyata in front. Without it, we call it a mantra. I'm sorry, I'll have to pass on that one. I won't be able to give you a satisfactory answer. There's probably somebody out there who knows what Teyata exactly means. But yeah, this is one of these, well, I just do it. But of course, there is probably a very meaningful explanation. So you are entitled to get that. So, and then somebody started saying, can you say something about the tanka behind you? This is something called the five vision. What is it again? Sikpangaden, the fivefold vision. It was Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo who had a vision of himself picnicking in India together with some of his teachers and friends. Somebody called Leschly Dorje, but this was Shenpen Taya, Gyaltse Shenpen Taya, who transmitted the Longchen Nyingtik to him. Then his teacher Shalu Lose Tenkyong, who transmitted the Kala Chakra teaching to him. Then Jamgon Kongtrul, who was a teacher and close associate of his, and then the great treasure finder Chögyö Dechen Lingpa. So there's this mandala of these five masters together. So Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo in the middle, and these masters around, sort of all in Heruka attire. So it's called the fivefold vision. And then about Teyata, somebody says, Teyata means the mantra is spoken this way. Oh, there you go. All right. So thank you for that. Okay. See you again.